I ask you to
Here we
picture the
go.
most...
Imagine the most dangerous dog in history. Of all time in history. Let's go ahead and get to the video, shall we?
dangerous dog to ever exist, you might think of an English Mastiff or a German Shepherd. Or maybe you're thinking of a wild animal, like a rabid grey wolf. And look, those are all definitely scary, but they're still just normal dogs. They have normal dog proportions, normal dog teeth, and they hunt in ways that make sense to us. So what really was the deadliest dog to ever exist on this planet? Now, when most people think of a terrifying giant dog that lived in the past, they immediately think of a direwolf. Thanks to pop culture, and specifically Game of Thrones, everyone has this image in their head of the direwolf being this absolute monster. We picture them being the size of a horse, carrying human beings on their backs and tearing through armies. But the reality of the direwolf is actually incredibly disappointing. Direwolves were completely real, and they did hunt alongside animals like saber-toothed cats in North America. But
Worried you're an AC?
a direwolf was essentially just a slightly bulkier grey wolf. If you put a modern grey wolf and a prehistoric direwolf next to each other, you'd barely even be able to tell the difference. The direwolf had slightly heavier bones and a slightly wider head, but it weighed around 150 pounds. And that's big for a wolf, sure, but it's not a mythical monster. It's basically just a normal wolf that spent an extra few months at the gym. Which is cool and all, but it's not exactly taking down dragons. They hunted the exact same way modern wolves do. They looked the exact same, and eventually they just went extinct because their specific food sources dried up. So if the direwolf wasn't the giant, horse-sized monster we all thought it was, what actually was? This is Epicyon haydoni, the largest canine to ever walk the planet. And when I say large, I don't mean slightly bigger than a wolf. I mean this animal completely changes what a dog can even be. An average grey wolf today weighs around 100 pounds. A really large one might hit 130. Epicyon haydoni weighed up to 370 pounds. This is basically just a grizzly bear that happens to have canine DNA. Imagine standing in a forest and looking at a dog whose shoulders are completely level with your chest. Its head alone is the size of a microwave. Its paws are the size of dinner plates. Which is probably not a dog you want jumping up on the couch. When you scale a canine up to nearly 400 pounds, it stops looking like a dog entirely. Its neck gets incredibly thick just to hold up its giant skull. It completely loses that lean, graceful look of a husky or a wolf. It just looks heavy. But getting crazy big isn't exactly a new evolutionary trick. Plenty of animals get big. What made Epicyon a nightmare was what it actually did with that size. One look at its skull and you'll immediately realise this thing was hunting in a completely different league. If you look at the skull of a modern wolf, a coyote, or a fox, they all share a similar design. They have long, narrow snouts. This design is great for snapping at small prey, or for grabbing onto the back of a deer's leg and holding on while the animal runs. Modern dogs have teeth that are just built to puncture and hold on. But if you look at the skull of an Epicyon, the long snout is completely gone. Instead, the face looks like this. The snout is completely smashed in. The cheekbones are massively flared out, and the jaws are thick and heavy. Honestly, if you didn't know it was a dog, you'd probably guess it was a hyena, or a lion, or just a complete genetic mistake. And that's because Epicyon belonged to a very specific, extinct subfamily of canines called the Borophagidae, or, translated into plain English, the bone-crushing dogs, which, as far as scientific names go, is pretty straight to the point. Epicyon was built to bite straight through solid bone. When you have a long snout, you lose leverage. Think about a pair of scissors. The closer you put something to the hinge, the easier it is to cut. By shortening the snout, evolution moved Epicyon's teeth closer to the jaw joint, which means they could bite down hard. Combined with the massive muscles attaching to its flared cheekbones, Epicyon had a bite force that makes modern wolves look pathetic. If a normal wolf bites a cow femur, the wolf's teeth will break. If an Epicyon bit a cow femur, the bone would literally explode into splinters. So yeah, playing fetch with this thing would get really expensive really fast. These heavily reinforced premolars were completely flat and thick. They were basically just massive anvils used to completely shatter the limbs of their prey. But this raises a very obvious question. Why would evolution ever build a dog this extreme? Nature doesn't randomly build a 370-pound bone-crushing dog for fun. Growing to that size requires a massive amount of calories. Keeping those jaw muscles working requires even more energy. If you can survive by just being a normal 50-pound coyote eating rabbits, evolution will keep you as a 50-pound coyote. You only become a 370-pound monster if the environment physically forces you to. And the environment Epicyon lived in was completely unhinged. Epicyon lived in North America during the Miocene epoch, roughly 15 million years ago. And the animals walking around North America back then weren't the deer and elk we have today. These plains and forests were packed with absolute giants. There were early species of rhinoceroses walking around. There were giant camels that stood incredibly tall. There were heavily armored herbivores and massive ground sloths. If you're a normal 100-pound wolf and you try to bite a prehistoric rhino, the rhino is just going to ignore you. It's basically just going to look down and go, "Was that a mosquito?" So if you actually wanted to eat one of these things, you had to get big. Epicyon got massive because its food was massive. It needed to be 370 pounds just to have the weight to wrestle a giant camel to the ground. And it needed the bone-crushing jaws because when you're fighting an animal with bones as thick as tree branches, normal teeth just don't work. You have to be able to snap their limbs to stop them from running. But maxing out your size comes with a very serious problem. When you weigh 370 pounds, physics starts to work against you. Modern wolves are incredibly successful hunters because they have insane stamina. A pack of wolves can jog at a steady pace for 30 or 40 miles a day. When they find an elk, they don't try to kill it instantly. They just chase it. They run and run and run until the elk literally collapses from total exhaustion. Wolves are built for endurance. They lean, their chests are narrow, and they're lightweight. Epicyon couldn't do this. When you're carrying
Disney Plus, Hulu, and HBO Max. The best in entertainment in one bundle.
This world goes deeper than you imagine.
I hope that's not what you're wearing. The crown is a weight that crushes.
Get the Disney Plus, Hulu, HBO Max bundle.
I saw that people in my community needed affordable homes closer to their work. But before we could break new ground, before we could help build the homes people needed, and before we can help shorten their commute, we needed someone to listen.
At JP Morgan Chase, we listen to what people need, so we can pull in the financing, investment, and support to help communities create affordable homes all across America. Together, we make what matters happen.
Carrying nearly 400 pounds of muscle and heavy bone, you cannot run for miles. If an Epicyon tried to sprint after a camel across an open field, it would overheat and completely gas out in a matter of minutes. Its body was just way too heavy to keep running. So if you couldn't chase your prey, how do you actually catch anything? You hide. Since Epicyon couldn't run down prey, it had to ambush them. They relied heavily on the dense forests that covered North America at the time. They'd wait in the thick brush, completely silent, waiting for a rhino or a camel to walk by. And then they'd explode out of the trees. Instead of running for miles, they relied on one short sprint to close the distance, tackle the animal, and deliver one bite. But Epicyon wasn't the only ambush predator hiding in the forest back then. So what happens when the biggest dog in history runs into the most famous prehistoric cat? While they didn't overlap perfectly in every region and time period, North America was home to both giant Boer-Affiigene dogs and massive saber-toothed cats like Smilodon. And comparing these two is interesting because they hunted in completely opposite ways. Smilodon was all about precision. It had those massive canine teeth that could reach up to 8 inches long. But here is the thing about those saber teeth. They were actually incredibly fragile. If Smilodon bit into a thick bone, its teeth would snap right off. And a predator without any teeth is, well, a dead predator. Their entire hunting strategy relied on wrestling prey to the ground, pinning it, and then delivering one clean slice to the soft tissue of the throat to bleed the animal out. Epicyon was the exact opposite. It had absolutely zero precision. It was pure, blunt force trauma. So, if these two actually fought over a carcass in the forest, who wins? Well, the cat is definitely more agile. Smilodon had massive front arms equipped with sharp claws, meaning it could actually stand up on its back legs and swipe. Dogs don't have functional arms. An Epicyon can only fight with its face. But if the Epicyon actually manages to land a bite, the fight is instantly over. If Smilodon tries to swipe and the Epicyon catches the cat's leg in its mouth, the bone-crushing jaws would instantly shatter the cat's forearm into dozens of pieces. And if the cat tries to bite the dog, Epicyon's skull is incredibly thick. If Smilodon accidentally strikes a thick part of the bone skull with its fragile saber teeth, the cat's teeth are going to snap off. The cat has the agility, but the dog has a bite that makes the cat's defenses completely useless. One solid crunch and the cat is permanently disabled. But realistically, a cat would never even try to fight an Epicyon, because the cat would almost never be fighting just one. A single 370-pound dog with a bone-crushing bite is already a nightmare, but dogs are almost never solitary animals. And while we obviously can't go back in time to watch them hunt, paleontologists have studied the brain cavities of Borophagean dogs, and their brains show the exact same structures that modern pack-hunting dogs have. This means Epicyon almost certainly lived and hunted in packs. Just think about the scale of that for a second. One grizzly-sized dog is a problem. A coordinated pack of 5 or 6 grizzly-sized dogs working together is just completely unfair, which is exactly why they were at the very top of the food chain. A single Epicyon might struggle to bring down a giant prehistoric rhino on its own, but if 3 of them launch out of the brush at the same time, hitting the rhino with over 1,000 pounds of combined muscle, the rhino is going down. Pack hunting allowed them to take down prey that was massively larger than themselves. They could surround an animal, cut off its escape routes, and use their sheer weight to drag it to the ground. But being in a pack also means you have a lot of massive mouths to feed, and when you have 5 370-pound dogs living together, you need a ridiculous amount of meat just to keep everyone from starving. So what happens when the hunting goes bad? In the wild, predators actually fail most of their hunts. Lions, wolves, and cheetahs fail far more often than they succeed. And when a drought hits or prey becomes scarce, predators are usually the first things to die. Starvation is the biggest killer in the animal kingdom, but Epicyon had an insane advantage that allowed them to survive famines that would wipe out any normal predator. Let's say a drought hits, the herbivores are dying, and the meat is gone. If a normal grey wolf is walking through the forest and finds the carcass of a deer that died 3 weeks ago, the wolf is out of luck. The vultures and insects have already eaten the meat. All that's left is a sun-bleached skeleton. The wolf can't eat the skeleton, so the wolf starves. If Epicyon finds that exact same skeleton, it just eats the skeleton. Problem solved. This is the true power of being a bone crusher. Bones are actually packed with nutrients. Inside the hard outer layer of bone is the marrow, which is packed with fat and calories. Normal predators simply cannot access these calories because their teeth aren't strong enough to actually crack the bone open. Epicyon could. When food was scarce, they could literally just walk around the forest, scavenging the old, picked-clean skeletons that the other predators left behind. They'd use their massive premolars to crack open the femurs and ribs, extracting the high-calorie marrow inside. They didn't waste anything. They could get calories out of literally any part of an animal. This meant they could survive in the harsh conditions far longer than the cats or the normal dogs around them. But despite this massive advantage, life for an Epicyon was still absolutely brutal. When you hear about a 370-pound pack-hunting dog that eats solid bone, it sounds like an unstoppable monster. But paleontology tells a very different story. When scientists dig up the skulls and skeletons of Borophagean dogs, they're looking at absolute trauma. The fossils of these dogs are covered in healed fractures, smashed cheekbones, and completely broken teeth. Because when your entire survival strategy revolves around tackling giant rhinos and massive camels, you're going to take some serious damage. These herbivores were huge, and they fought back. If an Epicyon lunged at a giant camel and missed the vital spot, that camel is going to kick. And a kick from a prehistoric camel carries enough force to instantly cave in a skull. So, try to avoid that. The fossil record showed that these dogs routinely survived having their faces smashed or their ribs broken, but surviving an injury in the wild is incredibly costly. If a dog's jaw gets broken by a kick, it can't eat, and if it can't eat, it dies. Their extreme hunting style meant they lived very violent, very short lives. They were the apex predators, but they paid for that title with constant physical trauma. So they clearly took damage from their prey. But how would they handle a fight against something their own size? We know Epicyon was the size of a grizzly bear, but what if it actually had to fight one? If a 370-pound Epicyon and a 400-pound modern grizzly bear actually fought, you'd get to see exactly where the dog's anatomy completely fails. At first glance, the Epicyon actually seems like it would win. Its jaw is designed to shatter bone. A grizzly bear has a very strong bite, but it's an omnivore. Its teeth are built for an omnivore diet, not instant, bone-crushing executions. If the Epicyon gets its jaws around the bear's neck or leg, he can do massive, permanent damage instantly. But the bear has something the dog will never have. Arms. Okay, technically they're front legs, but you get the point. Dogs are completely locked into fighting with their mouths. Their front legs are just pillars used for running and standing. They can't grab, they can't pull, and they can't pin. A grizzly bear can stand completely upright. It can swing its arms with enough force to break a moose's spine. And most importantly, it can grapple. If the Epicyon lunges, the bear doesn't just have to take the bite. The bear can use its massive front arms to swat the dog out of the air. Or worse, the bear can just tackle the dog and pin it to the ground. Once a bear pins you, bite force completely stops mattering, because you can't exactly use your bone-crushing jaws when 400 pounds of angry fur is sitting on your chest, basically going, what are you gonna do about it? The dog has the better bite, but the bear is just built way better for a one-on-one fight. But luckily for an Epicyon, it never had to fight grizzly bears. It had to fight something much, much worse. For millions of years, Epicyon was the undisputed king of North America. They had the perfect size, the perfect bite, and the perfect environment. And then, the world started to change. The Miocene epoch started coming to an end. The global climate started getting cooler and much, much drier. And when the climate dries out, the plants change. The dense forests that covered North America slowly started to die off. The thick brush and the tall trees were replaced by something completely different. Grass. Endless, wide-open grassland began to take over the continent. Now, if you're a grazing herbivore, this is great news. There's food everywhere. But if you're an Epicyon, this is a complete disaster. Because remember how Epicyon actually hunted? They weighed 370 pounds. They had zero stamina. They couldn't run for long distances. They survived entirely by hiding in the thick forest and ambushing prey from the shadows. But suddenly, the shadows were gone. When the forest disappeared, Epicyon was left standing in the middle of a wide open plain. There was nowhere to hide. You cannot conceal a 370-pound dog in ankle-high grass. It's just not a very stealthy look. And to make matters worse, the prey started adapting to the plains. The early horses and camels evolved longer legs. They got lighter and they got much faster. With the trees gone, they could see predators coming from a mile away and just sprint across the flat ground. So now, the Epicyon is completely exposed and the food is suddenly running twice as fast. If an Epicyon spotted a horse on the plains, it had to try and chase it, but the dog was just too heavy. It would sprint for a minute, overheat, and watch the horse disappear over the horizon. And this is the biggest irony of how they evolved. The exact same traits that made them so deadly, their extreme size and heavy bones, are exactly what killed them. Maintaining 370 pounds of muscle requires a massive amount of food, but because they were so heavy, they could no longer catch the food they needed to survive. Their incredible strength literally became dead weight. They couldn't adapt. They couldn't just shrink overnight. And so, the largest, most powerful dogs to ever exist slowly just starved to death. But the canine family didn't go extinct, because while the giant bone crushers were dying out, something else was already surviving right under their noses. While Epicyon was ruling the forests, there were other types of dogs running around North America. These were small, scrawny, and honestly, kinda pathetic compared to the bone crushers. These were the ancestors of modern wolves and coyotes. During the time of these forests, the smaller dogs were basically just scavengers. They stayed out of the way, ate whatever small prey they could find, and avoided the giant Epicyons at all costs. They completely lacked the bone-crushing jaws and massive muscles, but they had the one exact thing the giants didn't: stamina. Because they were small and lightweight, they didn't overheat. When the forest died and the open plains took over, these scrawny dogs didn't panic. When a horse took off running across the plains, these smaller dogs didn't try to outsprint it. They started jogging, and they kept jogging, for hours. Instead of trying to kill a horse in one bite, they just let the horse exhaust itself until it collapsed. They basically just jogged behind it going, "Take your time, buddy, we've got all day." The environment had completely flipped the rules of survival. Hitting hard didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was how long you could run. The overpowered monsters starved to death, and the scrawny underdogs thrived. Endurance suddenly mattered way more than sheer damage, and those scrawny dogs eventually evolved into every single wolf, coyote, and domestic dog today. But what if we could bring the giant back? Let's say we somehow cloned an Epicyon and dropped a pack of them into a modern environment, like Yellowstone National Park. How would the ultimate canine actually perform today? Honestly, they'd fail completely. The modern world is simply not built for a 370-pound ambush dog. If they tried to hunt a modern elk or a pronghorn antelope, they'd be humiliated. Most herbivores are completely built for speed and endurance. A pronghorn can run 55 miles per hour. An Epicyon wouldn't even be able to get close. They could try to hide in the forests, but modern forests aren't packed with slow rhinos anymore. The prey is too small, too fast, and too alert. They might be able to scavenge for a while, using their bone-crushing jaws to eat the skeletons left behind by modern wolves or bears. But eventually, the fact they needed so much food would catch up to them. There just isn't enough heavy meat walking around North America anymore to sustain a pack of dogs that size. They'd be the most dangerous animal in the park for about a week, and then they'd just starve all over again. Because being the biggest and the strongest doesn't actually mean you're the best. When we think about apex predators, we usually assume that bigger is always better. We think that the more bite force, more muscle, and more weight makes an animal superior. But when you over-specialize into one specific strategy, like being a giant ambush predator, you become incredibly successful in that exact moment. You become the deadliest thing in the room, but you also become completely dependent on that room never changing. Epicyon evolved perfectly for a world of dense forests and slow giants. Realistically, the true ultimate canine is just the adaptable, high-stamina wolves and wild dogs we have today. They might lack the insane strength and bite force, but they're still here, and the giants are just bones in the dirt. But anyways, I'm happy the dogs we have today are a lot cuter. Plus, I'm a cat guy anyway, as you might have known.